welcome to all of you to this breakout session on e-commerce, where we would like to discuss what a mapping exercise could look like for this world of e-commerce. Now, Torbjörn, who is an expert on the topic of e-commerce, is in this session. My colleague from UNCTAD. My name is Marion Janssen. I work at the International Trade Center. I'm a director here, and I'm notably responsible for the analytical work and data work on e-commerce. Torbjörn already mentioned in the chat that we have already in this field of e-commerce made some efforts to move into the direction of mapping activities that exist, and the UNCTAD has been taking a lead on this. If the world was all perfect, we wouldn't need this discussion today because we would say we already have a map. So I would like to propose the following, Torbjörn, if you agree. I kick off the session by asking those of you who are not working for UNCTAD or ITC or WTO, the three trade players in Geneva working on e-commerce. I ask those of you who are not working in one of these three organizations to tell me what you know or don't know, or what is not ideal in your understanding of who does what on e-commerce. That's my first question. E-commerce, where I'm thinking of having the focus on the trade side of e-commerce. And then I would like to use the second half of the discussion to ask you something different. When we trade digitally, we nevertheless have to deal with areas that are not strictly spoken trade areas. And I think this was raised partly by Stefania. We have to deal with issues like, is there infrastructure for e-commerce? Are there regulations for e-payments, for data protection? Do people have skills to deal with e-commerce? So after having had a short discussion on, do you know who does what on e-trade, on the trade with a focus on trade, I would like to move into, and if we want to map how all this e-commerce relates to the other relevant areas that are not directly set by the three agencies in Geneva that I just mentioned, the WTO, the UNCTAD, and ITC. With this, I hand over the floor to the audience, but with one last question. Stefanie, are you the chat moderator in this session?
Yes, Marion, hi to everyone. Hello.
Okay,
here.
So what I would like to do, Stefanie, that at some stage I ask you whether there's anything interesting I would have to pick up from the chat.
Very good.
Okay, excellent. So who would like to start? Who would like to ask a question in the speaking session of this interventions? Who would like to raise their hand? I see Richard. Richard.
No, it is tough time now, Marion.
No, not a tough time, because I'm going to respond very politely to Marion's extremely appropriate question, and I'm of course keeping up the tradition of being the first intervener in anything to do with Diplo. So I posted extensive comments on the chat, so anybody who's heard me speak knows what I said, and I won't repeat them in detail. But Marion, so I don't actually work for anybody anymore except myself. I'm retired. I used to work for ITU. I'm well aware of what's happening in UNCTAD and WTO, but also on what's happening or has happened in the past elsewhere, in particular UNCITRAL and other agencies, WIPO and so forth. And I have a very strong view that unfortunately issues that are not really directly related to trade have been sucked into WTO because the developed countries, in particular the US, have greater bargaining power in WTO, so they use that to impose things that they couldn't get elsewhere. TRIPS is the perfect example of that, and we're seeing a replay of TRIPS now in other areas. Let's just take one specific issue, because you mentioned expertise. I happen to know quite a bit about e-signatures, which was handled in UNCITRAL quite a long time ago to everybody's satisfaction. And what we're now seeing in trade agreements are essentially attempts to renegotiate the content of UNCITRAL agreements, which are model laws, which were very difficult to reach agreement on because it's a complex area. And I was at one of the WTO public sessions It's not a WTO negotiating session. They don't do that, but they have side events which are public. And there were people from industry that were explaining a particular need of e-signature, which I know very well because we worked on that. I worked on that many years ago. And I pointed out that said, well, you know, this is a known problem and it's defied solution for many years, and everybody understands why, who is an expert in the area. Why do you think that a couple of paragraphs in a trade agreement are going to solve a problem that has deep technical and other issues that experts have been thinking about for 20 years and not be able to solve? And the people said, oh, but that's not what WTO is doing. They're not trying to renegotiate UNCITRAL language and so on. And I said, well, no, look at the proposals. I realize they're not public, so you can't get them, but some people are able to get them. And when you look at what they're doing, that's exactly what they're trying to do. They're trying to renegotiate what was agreed in UNCITRAL many years ago. This is just total nonsense. So I submit that really WTO, to the extent that it should exist, which is dubious, should focus on core trade issues, which is removing custom barriers, removing impediments to trade and things like that. They should not be doing things that are not directly related to trade, such as intellectual property, such as e-signature, such as spam. That's another brilliant one. Since when is spam a trade issue? If spam is handled, it should be handled in ITU or somewhere else. I don't care, but it's got nothing to do with trade.
Richard, allow me to intervene. I see your passion.
I'm done anyway.
Even through the screen, it's reaching me. But don't leave us immediately. I take over me. So you were rather referring to the second item, to the interface between trade and other areas. You are arguing we are back in a TRIPS situation where what was originally negotiated at the WIPO was moved to the somehow to the WTO, but there are other examples, Richard. When it comes to labor standards, it has been always made very clear that that type of regulations is set at the ILO and is not brought into the WTO. So one question is, why do we get these dynamics that things move into the trade space? But we are here discussing mapping, not so much dynamic of what is negotiated how. So maybe mapping could contribute to making more transparent what could be discussed where, and from there delegates would have, or negotiators would be able to take different decisions on what they want to negotiate. But moving back to the original questions, I think Derek, he seems to want to raise his hand. Yes. Derek?
Yes. Good afternoon. Thank you so much. No, my question was about actually e-commerce per se and the space in which it operates. And by definition, it's global and doesn't have boundaries. And then linked to that question is actually new monetary instruments, Libra and others, which are potentially also non-geographically bound. So I was just wondering, are we using the right tool, which is the WTO and others, which are geographically bound type of negotiations, especially on trade, about borders and this type of things, and trying actually to put in a box where actually digital space is a different animal. So I was just wondering if maybe there could be an opportunity to have new types of institutions emerging to address this kind of transversality that e-commerce actually offers as an opportunity to maybe actually create new types of exchanges which are beyond traditional borders.
Derek, may I follow up with a question? So the new type of institutions, would you see them as institutions dealing with something for which we don't have an institution yet? I'm thinking of, for instance, pure data sharing regulation, or you were saying new financial instruments type of regulation, or something that is transversal, moving into the different areas?
Well, I made actually a small comment earlier on, actually in the plenary, in the comment box, and it's really based actually to the entities of the system, and we move from nation states to corporations to the individual. And I think what is key today are digital identities and to build trust. And these are becoming the building block of the system. It's really actually Richard mentioned e-signatures, but that's linked to a digital identity. So finding an institution who could secure the identity, and that's actually the complex aspect of it. Because on one side, you have your geographical identity, like you're Swiss, German, American, whatever, and then you might have a digital one. And that might entail new things. And that could be a way to kind of find some commonality. And maybe Geneva, Switzerland, or whatever other mechanism could actually infuse trust to have that building block, like a Lego, to then build whatever can be achieved in, let's say, the digital space. So maybe it's linked to data, but also actually to the identity itself of the actors of the system. And maybe that's where maybe some research could be undertaken.
So so then maybe our map of who does what should contain non-existing players who could start to be dealing with different types of items, and you propose a certain direction in which to think. I think Torbjörn wants to intervene, and after that, Marilia. Torbjörn?
Thanks, Maria.
Good to see you.
Thank you, you too. Just two things. First, I agree, of course, with the point that they have three main trade bodies in Geneva, UNCTAD, WTO. But in the context of mapping, it's worth noting also that organizations like WIPO, the South Center, CATS International, ITU, UPU, although not exactly Geneva, but Bern, UNECE, Diplo, ILO since 1 week, the World Economic Forum, and Enhanced Integrated Framework are all participating in this joint effort that we have together with the E-Trade for All initiative. So it's broader than just a purely trade thing that deal with e-commerce. The other point I wanted to make after listening to Derek, another partner of E-Trade for All is e-residency of Estonia. And they are offering virtual citizenship of Estonia for people that may be living anywhere in the world, that allows them to trade in the European Union, but they have every right except for voting in the Estonian Republic. So it's an interesting example to say what Derek was alluding to.
Thanks, Torbjörn, for this. So you are raising that already some of the players who are active in e-commerce related issues. Now, UPU is a fantastic example, crucial player for e-commerce, but not a pure trade agency. But of course, when it comes to logistics, an important player. And so you are saying that we are already getting a mapping that goes beyond the pure commerce area, and that the central point of this is the E-Trade for All initiative. Marilia, you wanted to take the floor.
Yes, hello, Marion and everyone. Well, actually, I would like to ask how you see the connection between the regional discussions, the regional trade agreements, and the mapping exercise, because it seems to me that, at least from the proposals that we see now in the GSI, a lot of the text is actually coming from regional trade agreements, either on access to the source code or data flows and so on. So it seems to me that when we map an issue in Geneva, this issue has already made into law and is already being enforced somewhere else. So Geneva is a little bit late when it comes to these discussions. Do you think, besides what Torbjörn suggested, that we should map an enlarged group of actors, do you think that we should also map regional trade agreements in terms of issues so we can prepare in Geneva, because we know that something is coming and probably the text will be taken from regional trade agreements to trade negotiations in Geneva as well?
Yeah, I actually have a view on this, and I say it in this way because I've published on exactly that question. I published, I think, earlier this year or the end of last year, a chapter on regional integration, the next wave. And one of the things we argued there, I wrote this with co-authors, is that various, after the Uruguay round, the WTO text was very much the lead for legal text in following regional agreements. We saw regional agreements copying text, copy-paste directly from WTO agreements. We see in several areas, and in particular the e-commerce area, the regional agreements currently being the driving force. So that's where legal innovation is happening in fields like e-commerce, and that would be therefore indeed an argument in favor of what you propose, having to look at what the regional agreements are doing. And I remember, Richard, that I was very thrilled to see that one of the first regional agreements dealing with e-commerce was making reference to UNCITRAL agreements. So that was one of the first cross-references to other international agreements. I use this opportunity to ask Stefanie if there's anything from the chat that I should become aware of, and maybe you can also remind me when we have to stop this session. Can we go to 3 p.m. or we have to stop earlier?
We have to stop earlier, Marion, although I'd hate to interrupt such an interesting discussion, but we do have just a few more minutes left.
Mm-hmm. I think Jasmine from Kutz wants to take the floor. Jasmine?
Oh, hi. Sorry. I just wanted to add on Marilia's intervention, and I think that monitoring what's going on in trade agreements, this is an exercise that Kutz has done recently, and we have a very, very recent study published in the past 2 months that I will share the link now, that gives an idea or tries to track down the kind of e-commerce related, whether e-commerce related provisions or specific chapters of e-commerce in trade agreements that have been conducted during the past 15 years. Again, this was a very useful exercise, yes, to try and see what could be the result of the ongoing discussions in the WTO. However, I add to the various voices saying that separating, having a very clear separation between e-commerce, other related issues like data and source codes and trade, have this very clear line. It's getting more and more difficult to identify it. So this mapping should really be larger than just the various regulatory frameworks in order to be able to identify this line. And yes, I also agree that we should try and include other organizations that not only are of international big organizations, but also an organization like CUTS and the South Center and others who are also working on the topic from a trade perspective, but also trying to really identify this separation line and if it exists.
Now, I have a question to whoever wants to take the floor before we have to close. Now, if I were to map the space we have, including any type of actors, as from the point of view of a central player in the trade sphere, let's say Torbjörn or UNCTAD or WTO, even if Richard may not like that, and if I were to take the same universe of players and were to make a mapping from, let's say, the cybersecurity type of point of view as a central starting point, or from a digital identity point of view, like Derek suggested, would my maps look the same? Would they look differently? Would we want to have multiple maps with the same elements? Just a thought, and happy to get any type of feedback. I don't see anybody wants to take the floor, but please just take off your mic if you want to react to this. I think it's the last intervention, Stefanie. Okay,
that's
before
correct.
We have to close.
Yes.
A quick comment. I think that will be partly overlapping and partly different, and that's the challenge in a sense that some organizations do multiple things, but they don't do always the same thing. So.
But would we want to have different maps with the same, let's say, fully overlapping maps, but with different shapes? Couldn't that be useful? Where in one, the UNCTAD WTO ITC would be at the center, and in another, they would be at the margin? Just a question, Richard, do you have a view on this? Where would WTO be if UNCITRAL was the center of the world?
No, I actually don't think anybody should be the center of the world because the issues are too complex. So I think that the current setup, although it's imperfect, is the best we can do. Specific agencies should focus on specific issues. And if WTO actually focused on what it's supposed to be focusing on, which was how to enable trade for the benefit of everybody and not just those of us who are lucky enough to live in rich countries, then things would be okay. The problem with WTO is not the principle of WTO. It's the way it's turned out because the rich countries have basically hijacked it and it's abusing its powers. So we just need a recalibration, and everybody should be working on what they're supposed to be working on.
Thanks, Richard. I'm thinking of MAP more like something that puts different elements in an order. When I looked at the WHO MAP, I would have maybe taken the same elements, the same links, but structured them in a different way. When I look at the world from a different angle, that was what I had in mind. Not so much what are the elements, but how are we organizing them? Stephanie, how will this happen at the end of this session? Will we suddenly disappear, or can I say a closing word? What's the setup?
You can say a closing remark. We have just 1 or 2 minutes left, and then we head to the main hall. I'll post the link.
Okay, Stephanie, tell me, is there anything from the chat that we missed?
Not really, but thank you. There are a few links, including the chapter that you wrote, report from Richard, and the CUT study. So thanks a lot for that.
So I think I thank you all for this, for the contributions to this discussion. I think we went beyond a pure mapping, a discussion on mapping exercises, but also into the direction of where should any new elements we want to add to our landscape, new regulations, new rules, new agreements, where should they be discussed? What is the forum choices that we have in front of us? And not only this, Derek went beyond mapping what exists into creating new things. I thank you all for having participated in this session, and I look forward to seeing you in the main hall again. Thank you, and thanks, Stephanie, for moderating the chat box. Have a nice afternoon. Goodbye.
Thanks. See you all in the main hall. The link is in the chat. Thank you, Marion.